It just seems surreal, the kind of response it's got, because it started off, as you know, really slowly. And I'm actually not somebody who follows box office numbers and all of that, but I had friends and my cousins and people writing and saying, what's happened? Why isn't the box office response happening? Because before it came to the cinemas, there were screenings that the team had done, and the response there had been something else. And it just didn't add up why the box office numbers weren't sort of correlating with that. But I'm just so overwhelmed, we all are so overwhelmed by the amazing word of mouth and audience response that it has got. And this was like my tribute to my grandparents, so even more so that something that was for them has got so much love. So all my grandparents were refugees in the partition, but my nani in particular grew up in Sargodha. And just before partition, in fact a few years before partition, she was already married to my grandfather and settled in India. And when partition happened and when the riots broke out, her parents and the rest of her family, her brothers, they refused to come. They didn't want to leave their home, and their lives were actually saved by their Muslim neighbors. And so my nani, for the rest of her life, was separated from her birth family. And I had never gone to Sargodha. In fact, for me, Sargodha was just, sort of fragments of stories that I had heard from my nani about these orchards of kinu, which are the oranges that grow, because Sargodha was known as the Mediterranean of the East, and about, legs of lamb that would be cooked in these tandoors outside in their garden. And how they would go to school, she and the siblings, in these horse-drawn carriages and all of that. But it was always just fragments of stories. And so actually when we managed to base the film over there, and the first time that I went on shoot, and I saw, sort of how the production design had big posters, film poster, where they had recreated the marketplace of Sargodha. And in fact, the research team had gone and stayed at my mama's house. My family still lives in Sargodha, part of my family. So for the research, I didn't get a visa in time, but our film research team had actually gone, Jassi and her team, and they had stayed with my mama, taken pictures of Sargodha, and then it was recreated in Punjab, near Patiala. And when I actually went there and for the first time saw this recreation, I knew it was all make-believe, but it was somehow the closest I'd come to my grandmother's childhood. So even, just the signs, one sign which, if in the film you can look out for, Inkalab printing press, and it says Sargodha underneath, which is Jia's family home. Or in the marketplace, when that big film poster says Vada, with the actor and actress, and underneath that it says the cinema hall in Sargodha. It just sort of was very moving. Through most of it, I didn't have I wish I could have been there through most of it, but I was there for a substantial part of it, and I was really happy that Imtiaz and the whole team were so welcoming of the writer being on set, because that's not always the case. So it was really a huge sort of privilege to be on set, to watch it all happen, to watch the words come to life with this quite extraordinary cast and crew, to watch the magic all happen, and a learning, because for me, a lot of times the writer is first in, first out. So this was really nice to be connected and to see how it all works. And Imtiaz would be very sort of, come here, sit with the sound engineer, put those headphones on, see how it's happening. So that was fantastic, and everybody was so warm. In fact, I remember, and it was very touching for me, when I landed at Chandigarh airport, the car that came to pick me up, there was this young taxi driver, and he said, मैं तो आ ही नहीं रहा था, I wasn't coming, but उन्होंने कहा राइटर मैडम आ रही है तो अच्छी वाली गाड़ी लेके जाना जो वेदांत सर के लिए ले जा रहे हो. So just those little things, because as writers all we need is just a little bit of respect, and this was a very beautiful experience. So I really believe that stories choose us. And this story, I believe, is because of an unfinished conversation with my grandfather. And my previous novel, which is also rooted in the partition and called Across the Line, it's published by Penguin. I think that was part of a conversation and I hadn't yet finished. And I was chosen for this conversation, and I'm so fortunate and I feel so blessed that this happened. But how it happened was, I was at the Dehradun Literature Festival talking about Across the Line, and the organizers asked if I would moderate a session, master storyteller session between Imtiaz Ali and Ruskin Bond. And I love both their work. I mean, Ruskin's work I have grown up reading, and Imtiaz's work more, later in life. But I was really happy to do that. And as it happened, Ruskin wasn't feeling too well on the day of the session, so they said, could you travel to Missouri and do the session there, because it was a sold out session and we needed to have it. And so Imtiaz and I traveled to Missouri from Dehradun. And in that car journey, he asked about my writing. I think I gave him a copy of Across the Line. And then after the session, he sort of said that I think there could be a match of sensibilities. So when you're in Bombay next, why don't you come to the office and we can talk about projects. And I came back to London and life went on. And actually this was a few years after COVID, but during COVID, I had kind of reached a point where I was questioning my purpose. And I remember saying, I think, to Imtiaz that I'm not sure that I really, even if I don't write anything in the future, I don't know what difference it will make, because how really is it going to change anything? And he just sort of smiled in that Sufi way that he smiles. And then, I thought of a story which actually involved Ruskin, and I sent that to Imtiaz. And he said, he read it and he said, I like the way you write, but I don't think we're going to find an audience for this. This is quite niche. But then the next time that I was in Bombay, he said, I have an idea. And why don't you give me a 20-30 pager based around this idea? And his idea was Main Vaapas Aaunga. And then I wrote up that 20-30 pager, sent it to him. And he wrote back saying, we have a match of sensibilities and we're ready to roll ahead. And that's how Main Vaapas Aaunga happened. So I was an investment banker in a previous avatar, but as you said, the writing bug was always there. And in college, in fact, I was part of a theatre group. I wanted always, I think, to tell stories. I wanted to actually act in musical theatre. That was my dream. I wasn't anywhere good enough to do that, but that was the dream. And at that point, I think my parents had sat me down and said, how are you going to put food on the table? You please get a job. And so I'd gone the MBA route, and then I was an investment banker for many years. But again, I think, you're chosen to do certain things, and things happen when they are meant to happen, and stories are told when their timing is right. So I became an author first with Penguin Random House, and then I wrote 3 novels, and then I wrote Shakuntala Devi, which again, in another interview, I can tell you how all that fell into place. But again, I think I was just chosen to tell that story. And then Main Vaapas Aaunga happened. So it's literally like a series of crazy events which I could never have imagined or planned for. And I can't take credit for any the sequence. They just happened, and I happened to be there and just turned up and did my bit. So absolutely, the messages were entirely unintentional. It was never about a message. For me, I think each person enters a project with something that they feel that they are doing it for. Very honestly, I was doing it for my grandparents, and I had seen that despite having lost so much, there was never, strikingly, never any rancor against the other. And even the name I chose of Nirvair, of course it's part of our prayer in the Sikh tradition, but Nirvair is the lack of rancor. And it was basically this emotion of theirs, of course the resilience, of course just erasing everything that they had been or had and building a new life. So that resilience, that sort of, they retained even the sense of humor. They retained the zest for life. They retained so much, and I wanted to pay tribute to the stories they could not tell. They did not have the luxury of grief. They were refugees. They did not have the words, a lot of times. And I felt that unspoken story of a generation. There were, I don't know, 14 million refugees who didn't have a chance to tell their stories. And it's a very important defining chapter of our history, which was glossed over for the most part. So I felt this need to tell that story. I'm often drawn to silences. As much as I love words, I'm drawn to silences. And I felt that silence was calling me. And as you said, that the bit about, the divisive element was never there. And they had all the reason to feel it. But they never did, because they had seen that the victims were in turn the aggressors. So it was literally people who had seen it firsthand, and that's why the most beautiful scene for me in our film is when they ask that Pali Dada, कि आप बताते क्यों नहीं? And he says, मैं बोलूँगा तो आप समझोगे नफरत. वो नफरत नहीं थी, वो कुछ और था, वो जहर था. So to understand that difference. But no, my whole regret is I never spoke to my grandparents about it. So the hope is that a lot of youngsters, a lot of people now get the chance, if they are fortunate enough to still have their parents and grandparents, have those conversations. So this story is not based on Across the Line. Across the Line is a separate story. But yes, when you're writing a book, it's like your baby. And it's the same with writing a screenplay, but then with a screenplay, it's like you give that baby up for adoption, I feel. And then it's with the director and with the everybody else who has a say. And here it was beautiful because Imtiaz was also writing it with me. So the vision from the beginning stayed the same. It didn't suddenly change. And we both were on the same page, so to speak. But as you said, once it goes, the actor can, bring their own interpretation to it. And I think in this case, there are lots of times when what you write is, you look at the screen and say, that's not exactly what I thought. I will say even in this case, it was not exactly what I thought, because it was far better. What Nasir Saab brought especially, and Diljit, and even the youngsters. It far exceeded what I thought these words could look like. It was just absolutely overwhelming to see those performances, and when the music comes in. And so, yes, in this case, it was I'm happy that this child was raised by such an incredible cast and crew. What was beautiful, Aditi, was that the first show in London, I wasn't here for, but my husband and daughters went with their entire, and I'm meaning not Indians only, there were Pakistanis, there were Chinese, there were Ukrainians, there were Russians, there were Japanese, there were Turkish people, all my children's friends, parents, just a whole lot, there were 40 of them who went together. And apparently, they all in some way related. I have messages from all these people, just talking about how this film spoke to them and moved them. And that for me was just so special, and especially a lot of my Pakistani friends have said that, it was so beautiful to see. It felt like you were telling our story. It wasn't like a story that only belonged here. And similarly, my friend from Japan also was telling me about a Korean connection, Irish. My family is in Ireland as well. They've gone to see it thrice. And they've seen a show that ends at 3 a.m. And the Irish people had the troubles as well. And you can call it by different names, this divisive nature of conflict, but it's existed everywhere. And it's not only conflict, there are so many layers to this story. So it's speaking to so many people in so many different ways. People searching for home, searching for identity, searching for belonging, searching for love. These are so universal. And it's been so beautiful to see it Even in, right now my family in Pakistan can't watch this movie. And, BBC had gone to my uncle's house in Pakistan actually a few days ago. And my uncle was saying, when will I see it? I'm feeling so left out. The rest of the world has seen it. So it's so beautiful how this story has spoken to so many people around the world. And now with the streaming platform, hopefully the reach will be even more. So, growing up, I've lived in so many different cities across India. The longest stop was Kolkata, but otherwise, I've always been kind of an outsider everywhere I went. I was always the new girl at school. I was kind of, I didn't really belong anywhere. I've lived in Munger, Saharanpur, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Calcutta, Delhi, Bombay, then Africa, then back to India, and then now London has been a long stint. So I think I like being at the periphery and watching. I'm more a watcher, and that's helped my writing perhaps. Also, it's interesting that when you're outside of the main sort of stream, you can be not so noticed, and I think you absorb more. So I luckily managed to go back a lot to India now. My mother is there, my family is there, my brother. So I get to spend a lot of time there with them thanks to my work being in India. And now that my daughters are at university, I'm hoping to spend more time in India. But yes, I'm a Londoner as well because I've been here for the last 18 years. And it's been so much a part of, very beautiful memories. And it's where all my books happened and my films happened, surprisingly out of here. So absolutely, but very much an Indian at heart. So I actually moved to Africa, like I said, and over there in Bombay, I worked with JP Morgan. They didn't have a branch in Africa. I applied for a job with Citibank, and I was working in oil and gas over there. So I had to go to this refinery. I'm telling you a slightly long story, but it's literally why I got into writing, I think. And at Port Harcourt, one of the Citibank employees got shot and he died. And this it was traumatic for me. And at that point, I just took a step back and I realized that I was going to do something different. And I think that was a turning point. And because I was so used to going to work every day, I actually auditioned just for a lark to write for Sesame Street, New York, and to write for their outreach program for children. And I got selected, and because I had never studied writing, I mean, I was an MBA and all of that, so I didn't know if I was good enough. So this came like validation that, okay, they think I'm good enough to write, and I started writing from there. And then I wrote for my own daughters, and that somehow, got published by Penguin. They picked it up, and my second book got picked. They commissioned me to write a second book, which was the gory story of Genghis Khan, which was again making history sort of interesting to children, to make them question a lot of things, like how history depends on who's telling the story. And then I was commissioned to write a third book, which was again history related, but when I sat to write, each time I sat to write, I would see a little boy playing Pittu in a gully. And I didn't know who this boy was. But I realized that it seems crazy to say this, but I think he was my grandfather. And he was in Rawalpindi. And I was being called by him to tell this story. And every time I sat to write, it was this story that came to me. And so I called my editor and I told her, I know I'm contracted to write a different story, but can we change the story? And she turned around and said, you're going to make me lose my job. This is not how it works. But she was good enough. I said, can I just please give you the first 3 chapters? And I did. And that got approved. And that became my book, Across the Line, which then went on to win the South Asia Book Award. And that is also rooted in the Partition. And that boy had a little tattoo on his wrist. And my grandfather had a tattoo on his wrist. And his tattoo in Urdu said Tarlok, which was his childhood friend. And growing up, all us cousins used to ask my grandfather, where is Tarlok now? Why do you have his tattoo on your wrist? And my grandfather would say, Kamina hai, pata nahi, uska koi ata pata nahi. And time passed and I went on my, life went its way. Much later, when I was researching about the partition, I found out that Tarlok had actually died in the partition riots. But my grandfather had changed the story, maybe for us, maybe even for himself. And that tattoo was also something that we brought in. You know how, I don't know, remnants of different memories are just, they remain in your mind and they come into different aspects of things one writes along the way. Similarly, like the kinus that my grandmother used to talk about. So Imtiaz also said, let's have his name as Kinu in the film. And my grandmother's, actually, her brothers were called Pali and Jia. And Imtiaz said, why don't you, so he said, let's have these names in the film. So all these little things about, the past somehow just remain, and you're not consciously actually doing any of this, but it seeps into the writing. And then from there came Shakuntala Devi. Again, I didn't plan to write a film. It basically, she had come to my school when I was little in Calcutta, and I remember her silk sari and the swish of her silk sari as she walked onto the stage, and it was like sort of very, I just remember the sounds, and then she was making fun of the maths teacher, and she was making fun of Miss Higgins, who was my principal, this little English lady. And she, I just thought telling a story about a brown woman whose superpower is math, and who is suddenly in a very white male world, which is when she came to London, ran away from home and didn't know how to speak English, had never been to school. I thought that was such a cool story to tell. But the cooler story actually turned out to be when my agents went looking for the life rights and found that her daughter Anupama Banerjee lived in London. And when we went to meet her, and she had just lost her mother, and she had a very fractious sort of relationship with her mother. So there was a lot of unprocessed emotions. There was grief and guilt and regret and anger and all of this. And she was talking to, to me and our director, and through that, I think there was catharsis happening, and at the end of it, the story that we wanted to tell was no longer a child to champion arc. It was a story of a mother and a daughter, and how a mother has to manage her gift. All of us as working mothers have to try and do the best we can with whatever gift we have, and also do the best for our children. And that's always a tightrope act. So I thought that would be a much more relatable story, because I'm not a genius. So that genius story would be beautiful, but would not always relate as much as this story would. And then when Vidya read it and loved it, then she came on board, and then that's how Shakuntala Devi happened. So I've signed a couple of films, and somebody was asking me, are you only going to write about 1947? Because I've lived there for so long now with my book and the film. I'm moving on from 1947. So they're very different projects, quite exciting, and they've got fabulous, fabulous talent attached. So I'm very excited about both of them. And there is also a web series that I've signed, and that's also again, that one is an adaptation of the book. So that's something I'm really looking forward to as well.